I know as I hear stories like that, it's easy for me to think of the initial impact, the immediate impact, especially when there's death and murder involved. And it's easy to focus on that and look at, okay, well, how bad was this particular pogrom that occurred? How many people were killed as a result of it? And we look at numbers of people who were killed, and we use that as a basis for determining just how serious the situation might be. But what we often don't realize is there are long-term mental, psychological effects from this type of persecution, from living in a place where the government willingly looks the other way while this type of persecution happens, often with the support of local police and various religious leaders as well. It has a long-term psychological and mental effect on the population who are being persecuted. Our next guest is going to speak to this. That's his area of expertise. He is a bishop in the Anglican Free Communion International. He specializes in overseeing starting new faith communities. But he's also a trauma therapist by trade. He's an expert in the psychological impact that things like this can have and the trauma that it can create in people. So please welcome Bishop Justin Meier.
Good evening. It is an honor and a privilege to be with you tonight. I have to be transparent and honest with you this evening. Little did I know about the persecution that was taking place in India till just months ago when I met Peter and when Joshua opened my eyes to the plight, the devastation, and the trauma that the folks in India were experiencing due to their religious affiliations and beliefs. Trauma can be almost as devastating as physical death when we look at the impact on a life. Trauma is an event that takes place that makes a person feel helpless, separated, alone, and their value is that of no worth. It's amazing what happens when a person comes into this world. When they are brought into this world, a creation of the divine, they're born and their brain beginning to develop and function and mature. The healthiest of brains logically process information through the frontal lobe, the frontal cortex. But over time, as people experience trauma, sometimes, oftentimes, that processing is moved further and further and further back in their brain. Now, in healthy families and situations, and in places where trauma is not a way of life, the brain recovers and pushes that processing back up to the frontal cortex, the frontal lobe. But when trauma is expressed and experienced over large periods of time, that processing stays closer back and further back next to the amygdala. Many of us know that the amygdala controls our fight, flight, and freeze responses. Well, when religious persecution takes place and is experienced over a long period of time, that processing literally becomes embedded in the back of the brain. And so people live in this on edge or tense moment. And many people think, well, okay, if someone is processing back there, that leads to numerous mental issues. right? You may face depression or anxiety. You may learn to even develop anger issues over time. But what is very interesting, and what we are finding out more and more every day, is that when people experience long-term trauma, it does not only lead to mental disorders, but it oftentimes manifests in physical disorders. People who suffer from long-term religious persecution and trauma, also developed over time, known as PTSD, begin to see severe obesity. They develop diabetes over time. They commit suicide on a higher level. They are more susceptible to sexually transmitted diseases. We see an increased rate of both heart disease and cancer. We see increased numbers of stroke and COPD. Believe it or not, trauma experienced over a long period of time leads to brittle bones in a person's body. You see, this religious genocide that is taking place is not only violence and murder for people's beliefs that are wiping out people, but it is a true genocide because the effects that then are experienced after someone has observed that violence, has been part of a community that has been ripped apart by persecution and violence, they begin to struggle lifelong. And here is what even is probably more heart-wrenching to me, and should be for those of us that are spiritual leaders today. Houses of faith, places of worship, have historically been known as places of healing. Places that help people overcome the trauma that they experience in their lives. Whether it is through the acts of prayer or meditation, building community and safe boundaries. When a person experiences trauma, oftentimes they find the psychological healing they need available in communities of faith. But in India, where people are scared to gather in places of worship, where they have to live on edge, believing that persecution might befall them inside their places of worship, or as soon as they disperse, that trauma in and of itself multiplies. And here we have an opportunity to bring healing to people in our communities. But that healing can't take place. And that trauma begets trauma. When you are experiencing life through the lens of trauma, through fight, flight, or freeze, if that is how you're processing information, right, you tend to lash out because everything seems new. You're constantly on the defensive, and so your relationships with your spouses is not a healthy place. Your relationships between parents and children are not healthy. Families, parents, children lash out and they don't know why. And trauma then continues to beget trauma, and physical issues beget physical issues. They almost become generational curses. So as us together join in hopefully making a clear clarion call, let us not only worry about the violence that takes place day by day, but let us think about the true physical and mental impacts that continue on. Because here's the thing, folks, even if the violence was to stop tomorrow, the impact without healing would last for generations. So let us work for today, for tomorrow, and the years to come to help foster an attitude of hope, help, and healing for our brothers and sisters in India. Thank you.
Thank you, Bishop. That was a very powerful reminder to all of us that we need each other. We need to be people who are known as a people of healing and help and peace.